I send
Well,
thee?
Lordy, then where will you send me? I'm gonna send thee one by one. One was a little baby, born by the Virgin Mary. Born in a Bethlehem.
Children, go where I send
Well,
thee.
Lordy, then where will you send me? I'm gonna send thee.
There was a study done at Rockford College where they took 100 students and put them all in a big room, which obviously sounds like every teacher's dream. But they took 100 students, they put them all in one big room, and then they took 3 students out, moved them out into the hallway, and they told the students that were still in the room, whenever the students come back in, we want you to shout any instruction that you want at these people. We want you to tell them to go out in the hallway, we want them to jump up and down, to run around in circles, whatever you want to do, shout any instruction at the top of your lungs at these students as they come back in. And so they told one student, though, in particular, they told him in private earlier that day, they said, we want you to have a very special message. We want you, as if your life depended on it, scream at this one student that comes in through the door to try and get him to walk all the way across the room and sit down in the chair at the other side of the room. Act as if your life depends on it. Scream at him at all possible. Do whatever you can without actually touching him to get him to move across the room. They took those 3 students that were out in the hall and they blindfolded all 3 of them. The first one they brought into the room, walked in, and as you can imagine, the room just erupted. Everybody was screaming instructions at them, everybody was yelling at them. And the one student that was in the room that had the very important message obviously couldn't be heard over everybody else. Before they brought the second person in, the second blindfolded person, they took the person that had the very important message and they said, we want you this time, instead of standing off in the distance, we want you to stand as close as possible to him, still without touching him in any way. We want you to try and get that person to move to the other side of the classroom and sit in this chair. But to add a little wrinkle in the equation, they also had a second student provide a counter message. So for every time that person was screaming at the top of their lungs, get in the chair, sit in the chair, sit in the chair, this other person was also tell him, do everything he could possible to not get him to sit in the chair. And so the second student walked in that was blindfolded, didn't know what was going on. The room erupts in sound, everybody's yelling at them at the top of their lungs. And these 2 students, one with the pro message, one with the anti-message, they're also yelling at him. But because the student really doesn't know what he should do, he kind of goes a little bit this way towards the chair, then he goes a little bit this way, but he doesn't really know how he should move, and so he just kind of vacillates for a little while. The third time they have this, they tell the student with the opposing message, this time we want you to be really loud. Try as hard as you can to not get the student to sit into the chair. But the person with the pro message, we're going to allow you at this point to gently place your hand on his shoulder. You can't move him, you can't push him, you can't pull him, but try everything you can. This time you can't actually put your hand on his shoulder. Try and get him to go sit in the chair. So the third person that was blindfolded walks back in the room erupts once again in sound, everybody's screaming at each other, you have the anti-message person that's screaming at the top of his lungs, don't go sit in the chair, don't go sit in the chair, and the student with the pro message walks over to him and gently whispers in his ear, I need you to sit in the chair, and then gently places his hand on his back. And almost like clockwork, that student who was blindfolded, who wasn't instructed anything previously, then turns and follows this student all the way to the other side of the classroom. Everybody's still screaming, everybody's still after it. And the student then gently sits in the chair. We live in a noisy world, I would say. And I don't think you would disagree with that. We live in a world where everybody's shouting instructions at each other, where everybody's telling you where to go, where everyone's telling you what to do, how you should live your life, what you should value, the things that you should do in your life. And so there's a whole lot of, wherever you're at in life, there's a whole lot of sound coming from all these different places. Whether it's your parents, whether it's your school classmates, whether it's your boss, whether it's your spouse, whether whatever, everybody is yelling at you from all these different ways. There's a whole lot of noise in this world. And that's why when you have something like the example showed where somebody very gently, very tenderly walks up and leads you very emotionally towards one specific way, we tend to lean towards that. Because after all, we care about people that care about us. And that's what that illustration, that's what that story showed, I think, in spades. As Jesus is about to ascend up to heaven, he's doing his last Great Commission. He's given the Great Commission. He has several things that he says right there in the end part of it. But the one section there in verses 18 and 19 is very interesting to me. Because at the very beginning of what he says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations. Notice what Jesus does not say in Matthew chapter 28, verses 18 and 19, before he ascends. He does not say, therefore, bring them unto me. He says very deliberately, go to them. Go towards where they are and talk to them about the gospel. That was the whole point of what he's talking about. And when we evangelize, when we take part in evangelism, no matter what aspect it is, whether it's formalized, whether it's informal, we need to go towards where people are at. That's the whole point of all of this. There was a study done. There was a man by the name of J.K. Johnston who studied the Gospels. I did not do this, nor did I verify this, so I kind of take this on faith, although I can see where he's at on this. J.K. Johnston examined the Gospels and tried to see in what capacities it was that Jesus brought the Gospel to people. Where did he interact with people? Where did he most oftentimes teach people about God? And in what would amount to about 132 contacts that Jesus had with people, 6 of those contacts were in the temple, 4 of them were in the synagogues, and 122 of them, 122, were with people in everyday walks of life. People that were out by the ocean, people that were out on the side of a mountain somewhere, people that were passing through towns. That's where he interacted with people. And when you look at the way that Paul interacted with people, he had a little bit of a different slant, but also kind of had the same thing. Acts chapter 9 and verse 20, 17 and verse 2, 18 and verse 4, 19 and verse 8, I have the space to put all those up there. But these people interacted with them in synagogues. Jesus goes out into the world to bring the gospel to where the people are. Paul goes into the synagogues to talk about Jesus because that's where the Jews are. That's where the people who are interested in Jesus are. Peter did not stand, or Paul did not stand in the middle of the town square, although I'm sure he did at some points in time, and just scream at the top of his lungs about who Jesus is. He could have done that. He probably did that on a couple of occasions. But he goes into the synagogues. He goes to Mars Hill. He teaches in the school of Tyrannus. He teaches on the Acropolis. Jesus and Peter, or Jesus and Paul, both understood the very central concept that in order to teach people the gospel, you have to at least go where they are. I think sometimes when we talk about evangelism, we talk about it in very one-dimensional terms, where the whole goal of evangelism is to, at any cost, no matter what it takes, no matter how much you have to plead, we have to get people through those 2 doors. Only one of them opens right now because the other one's locked. But we have to get them through those doors. We have to bring them in here. We have to sit them down. They have to sit right here in the front pew. They have to listen to me talk for 35 or 40 minutes. And then if at all possible, they have to come down forward. They have to accept the gospel. They have to be baptized and washed away their sins. But that is evangelism. And if we get nothing else out of the lesson this morning, what I want us to do is reorient our mind away from that very formalized capacity of evangelism and think about it in more informal terms. Taking the gospel to people. Engaging people in conversations in the workplace. As you're passing by in the big cubicle form known as L3, as you're passing by people, or whether you've got a nice big fancy office like Nathan does, whatever capacity you're in, walk by them and address them as human beings. Standing at the water cooler, standing in line at the grocery checkout, you see somebody's talking about gospel, or somebody has a Bible in their hands, engage them in conversation. If nothing else, if you get nothing else out of this lesson, think about how we can engage people in everyday, informal conversations. Those are the things that we need to have. But when you ask yourself the question of where people are these days, in 2018, most of them, at least in some capacity, are found online. Most of these people, no matter who you are, no matter what age you are, no matter what your demographic is, most of us, and I say most of us because I think of this congregation is about 60%, most of us have a Facebook profile. Some of us have a Twitter profile. But most of humanity in some capacity is online. If you just look simply at the stats, Facebook, which is known as the $100 billion juggernaut, has a monthly active, and I think in some ways it's very comparable to the daily active users, but a monthly active user base of 2.2 billion people. What that means is that every single month, 2 out of every 7 people on the planet log on to Facebook and watch cat videos, or look at what I ate for dinner, or whatever else it is, or look at what Corley shares, which is hilarious, by the way. We all log on and we engage with people in an online community. YouTube is, ironically, or very surprisingly, the second place most popular social media platform of 1.5 billion. You go down a little bit more, you have Instagram that's 800 million, you have Tumblr, which is 794 million, you have Twitter, which is 330 million, then you have, and I don't know if anybody's ever heard of this, you also have Reddit, 250 million, love Reddit. But that is a lot of people that are on online communities, that are on online spaces. And in case you think it's literally just at the time after you get out of bed and you're looking at it while the world is still dark, by the time you get into the living room to have your first sip of coffee, a little 2-minute window, that's not when most people are online. The average human being on this planet, not just Americans, but the average time for a human being on this planet to be on a social media platform is 2.5 hours a day. 2.5 hours a day. And I know there are some people in here that are looking at me thinking, I can't imagine spending 2.5 hours mindlessly scrolling through Facebook. To you, Shell, I would say give it a try. It's awesome. You should try it sometime. But that is a lot of time spent on social media platforms. And so if we're going to talk about evangelism in any type of capacity in 2018, we need to address the 2.2 billion pound elephant in the room, which is how to reach people on Facebook. When Jesus said in Matthew chapter 28, verses 16 through 20, I want you to go into the world, he didn't just mean go into the highways and byways, go into their houses, sit in Starbucks, and open up the little sign that says, I want to talk to you about the gospel, change my mind, anything like that. He's talking about very simply, go to where the people are. And in 2018, that means being on Facebook. That means being on Twitter. That means being active on Instagram. If you're one of those people that is active on Facebook, if you're one of those people that is active on Twitter, on Instagram, Reddit, whatever it is, here are some very basic ideas of how you can share the gospel. This is not by any means the meat of the lesson, so in case you're thinking we're just blowing through things step by step, it's not the meat of the lesson. But here are some very practical, boots-on-the-ground ways that you can engage with people online to help people understand the gospel. Number one is very simply to share biblical content. If you're on Facebook, if you're on Instagram, if you're on Twitter, I would encourage you, as part of your cat sharing or your dinner sharing routine, somewhere in there, share biblical content. I don't know how many people know, I'm sure everybody knows here, that Joe is the one that's in charge of the video camera, he's the one that's looking at these lessons, but he spends an exorbitant amount of time every week cutting the lessons, making me look fantastic. That doesn't really take a whole lot of work, but he spends a lot of time cutting the lessons, not only sharing them to the websites, but also putting them on Facebook. And I'll tell you, if you ask him about the shares and the views, because you can track how many people are viewing him, if you ask him about the views and the shares that people are getting, it's constantly, very slowly, but constantly on the increase by people in this congregation that are sharing the videos, sharing the articles, sharing biblical content within their networks. You also can do, if you don't want to share biblical content, you can start to invite friends. We're going to open up a very public Facebook page for Hillside probably at some point throughout the course of 2018. And we're going to be doing videos, we're going to be doing kind of text-based lessons, very simple types of things that we're going to do. But I would encourage you not only to invite people to like that page, but also to invite people to services. It actually works out perfectly. This is the way that I designed it this week, to sit before our gospel meeting with Wayne Fancher next week. But you have right there with our gospel meeting with Wayne Fancher a perfect opportunity to invite people to come to services. This is something that I've heard people do that I think is very practical. You can start a Bible challenge. If you're interested in this, if you want to read the Bible every day, encourage other people to read it alongside you. If you're doing your Bible challenge, if you're reading the Bible every day, you can live stream the Bible reading. There are some people who do this on Facebook and do it in a very weird, kind of poor way. But to me, there's nothing more simple than simply opening up your laptop, opening up your phone, reading the Bible for all of your friends to see. If nothing else, they'll be exposed to it on that one. You can tag your friends on scripture posts. You can write a personal testimony. I've used that word testimony very loosely because I'm not saying you need to sit down and talk about all the different things that God has done for you. But if there's something important to you that happened that day, and you know that it was by the hand of God, whether it's providence or whether you were just exposed to His Word or whatever the situation is, if there was something meaningful that happened to you that day, and there should be, I would argue every day, then there's no shame in talking about God and opening up the God dialogue with people that are on your friend list. You can also ask for prayer requests. Be careful about how you do this, because this can come off sometimes as spammy, it can come off sometimes as needy, but if you have a prayer request, simply ask for it. You can share verses with other people. That kind of goes along the line with that biblical content. You can also check into services. You can also, and I would argue to be very careful with this next one, you can also meet non-Christians. Meeting non-Christians is one of the best things that we can do as Christians. I would encourage you in the nature of social network, very selective about how you do that. If you do nothing else, and this kind of goes along with one of the earlier ones, a lot of these overlap, I would encourage you to give thanks very regularly. I would encourage you whenever you go on Facebook, instead of sharing cat videos, I don't know why cat videos are on my mind right now, but instead of just simply sharing cat videos, share verses. And just have a 2 or 3 line sentence on the things that you're thankful about today. And how thankful you are to God for those types of things. Now, I have 2 goals with this sermon, because when we talk about social media advertising or social media evangelism, we can get off the deep end and go into all these different nuances, but I'm very aware of the fact, as I look out here, that not everyone in this congregation is on Facebook. Not everyone here is on Twitter, not everyone here is on Instagram. So what my goal is not to do this morning is to be an advertising vehicle for Facebook. If you're not on Facebook, you don't want to be on Facebook, don't be on Facebook. As a matter of fact, I would argue if you're not on Facebook, don't get into the time-wasting aspect that it is in a lot of ways. But if you are on Facebook, these are some very good tips. The second thing that I want to do is not to make this sermon a Facebook-only type of sermon. Because the things that we're talking about this morning in terms of evangelism are not just specific to social media. Several of the things that we'll talk about, as a matter of fact, the 3 points that we have on our lesson this morning are not just isolated to social media. It's not as if there are only things that you can do online, only things that you can do on Twitter. These are very foundational, basic evangelism steps that we can implement in everyday life. And the first one comes straight from Jesus himself. When he says to the people, go to your own people. The very nature of social networking, the very nature of social media is that it's social. That's probably the big surprise of the day. But the nature of social media is that you connect with people that connect with you. You connect with people that have similar interests. You connect with people that have a similar community, whether it's a workforce, whether it's a school. But you connect with your own little world. And no two social networks are alike. So what I share on my social media network will not be what you share. But when you look at, for instance, Mark chapter 5, as Jesus is doing his miracle, and especially he performs one of the more interesting miracles, at least in my opinion. When you see him perform this miracle in Mark chapter 5, he tells the person here to do something very interesting. In Mark chapter 5, starting in verse 1, it says, they came to the other side of the sea, into the country of the Gerasenes. And when he got out of the boat, immediately a man from the tombs with an unclean spirit met him, and he had his dwelling among the tombs. And no one was able to bind him anymore, even with the chain. Because, verse 4, he had often been bound with shackles and with chains, and the chains had been torn apart and the shackles broken in pieces. And no one was strong enough to subdue him. That's a very intimidating sight, by the way. Verse 5, constantly night and day he was screaming among the tombs and in the mountains, gashing himself with stones. Seeing Jesus from a distance, he ran up and bowed down before him and shouted with a loud voice and said, what business do we have with each other, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I implore you by God, do not torment me. Which I want you to notice here in Mark the 5th chapter, especially the first 7 verses, is just how awful a situation this person is in. We read the story of the Gadarene demoniac, and we look at him and we think, this person is an oddity. He's somebody that people walked by and they looked at, they glanced at, and they didn't really give a whole lot of time. But when you read Mark chapter 5, and you read the details in those first 7 verses, you see a man that is tortured, now spiritually tortured by demons. You see a person that is tortured, and somebody who desperately wants to be freed of this torture. In verse 8, the demons are resisting them, because after he says, what business do we have with you? Jesus says then back to him saying, come out of the man, you unclean spirits. And there's some dialogue there between the demons and Jesus. They discuss different things about sending the demons into the swine. But eventually the demons are gone. And when you look down there in verse 18, the response of this man, after he was freed from this burden, says in verse 18, as he was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed was imploring him that he might accompany him. Verse 19, he didn't let him. But he said to him, go home to your people to report to them what great things the Lord has done for you and how he had mercy on you. Verse 20 gives a very specific geolocation by saying he went away and began to proclaim in Decapolis what great things Jesus had done for them. Everyone was amazed. Decapolis is not a city, by the way, in case you're looking for Decapolis on your map. Decapolis is a group of cities, 10 cities to be exact. And so when he tells this person here in Mark the 5th chapter, I don't want you to follow me, which is very understandable considering what Jesus had done for this person. Jesus tells him, Mark the 5th chapter, I don't want you to follow me. I want you to go back to your own people and tell your village, tell your community, tell everybody you know what I've done for you. Now the big question as you're looking at the situation is why? This is PR mistake number 1 by Jesus, depending on how you keep speaking. Because obviously the goal of any teacher, the goal of any person that wants to be famous, wants to be a celebrity, if you want to be an Instagram star, you have to have followers. That's a whole pun. So it's interesting that Jesus in this instance in Mark the 5th chapter is not interested in gaining people towards himself, but tells that person to then turn around and go back to his own community. Why is that? Because Jesus understands that the testimony of somebody who has been affected by the gospel or been affected by the words of Jesus is a very powerful testimony within the community. You're not going to listen to me unless you know me. You're not going to listen to me or much less care about what I have to say unless you know me at least a little bit. Unless I have some kind of credibility. And what Jesus, I assume, understood about this situation, this person, was that this person was going to have a much better understanding, a much better reach with the gospel if he goes home and shares it with his community, instead of being one of the hundreds of followers of Jesus at this point? The application for us is very simple. When we look around at our Facebook page, and it doesn't take you very long to scroll down your Facebook page or your Twitter profile or your Instagram to see people that are in desperate, desperate need of Jesus. That need hope. That need to understand about obedience. That need people to pray for them. I would encourage you to go amongst your own people. Take the things that we talk about within these 4 walls, 18 walls, whatever it is. Take what we learn here in these 4 walls, which you learn in your own Bible study, and go into your community. Teach the gospel to people. The gospel flows best, in my opinion, when it begins to flow through relationships. The goal of evangelism should not just be to simply get people on these pews. It should get people to be converted towards Jesus. And that happens through relationships. In John the 4th chapter, a couple books over, in John chapter 4, as Jesus is talking with the woman at the well, the woman is gone by verse 24, 25, I think. And Jesus is sitting back there and he's talking with his disciples. He's starting in verse 28. John the 4th chapter. It says, so a woman left her water pot. She was obviously amazed. That's when Jesus, right before that, had started talking about her husband. She says, I have no husband. How does Jesus know that? That's obviously the things that are going through her mind. Verse 28, the woman left her water pot, which shows just how entranced she was, for lack of a better phrase with this conversation. She went into the city and said to the men, come see a man who told me all things that I've done. This is not the Christ, is it? They went out of the city and they were coming to him. And Jesus has this dialogue with his disciples and his apostles there, verses 31 down to verse 38, where he opens their eyes to the everyday evangelism that is possible. Capstoned by the verse and by the phrase when he says, don't you see, or don't you say that there are 3 months and then the harvest? But I tell you, look up your eyes and you will see that it's ripe for harvest right now. Evangelism is not something that we do tomorrow. Evangelism is not something that we put off for the next day. It's something that is around us all the time. Verse 39, after the discussion with the apostles is over, verse 39, from that city many of the Samaritans believed in him because of the woman who testified. That's step 1. Because he said, he told me all things that I've done. But when the Samaritans came to Jesus, they were asking him to stay with them. And he stayed there 2 days. Many more than believed on him because of his word. And they were saying to the woman, it is no longer because of what you said that we believe, for we have heard for ourselves and know that this is the one who is indeed the Savior of the world. Evangelism flows best, ladies and gentlemen, when it flows through relationships. And what you see in this instance is a woman at the well that is just enamored by Jesus and the things that he has to say to her. She goes back into the town, she shares it with the townspeople, and they come in droves to Jesus. But that's not where the conversion happens. The woman's role is done as soon as she tells everybody, and they come to hear about Jesus, but it's only after listening to Jesus themselves that they can then turn around to the woman at the well and say, we don't just simply believe in him because of you, but because of we've heard it directly from his mouth. Our goal as Christians is always to point people towards Christ and not think that we have every answer no matter what happens in every different type of situation, but to always point people towards Christ. The gospel flows best when it flows through relationships. And so if you're sitting here this morning, you're thinking to yourself, how can I evangelize effectively? I live in 400 acres in the middle of nowhere. I have 2 cats by myself, and I never am a part of any clubs or never part of any groups in town. How can I evangelize? Because I have no community. You have a community of 200 to 300 plus people probably on your Facebook page that you can interact with, that you can share content with, that you can talk to directly, or at the very least, and I'm as guilty of all of this as anybody else. Guilty just by inviting people to church, inviting people to services, inviting somebody to have a Bible study with you. Nielsen one time released a study, Nielsen TV ratings released a study, and they surveyed 29,000 respondents from 58 different countries and asked them the specific question of why they bought a new product. Why did you buy the thing that you bought? Whatever it was, what was the newest thing you bought and why did you buy it? And underneath that was all these different categories. There was digital marketing, there was traditional advertising, there was word of mouth, there was all these different things. But the highest response rate, 77%, the highest response rate, said that they bought that new product because a family or friend told them about it. Dr. Thomas Rainer is a so-called church growth expert. And he spent several years going through churches all across the 50 states and asking them several questions about their church membership and their attendance. And he spoke specifically to non-Christians. He calls them the unchurched. And he talked to church, the people who call themselves Christians, who are members so-called churches. And what he found was, among the unchurched, the people who are non-Christians, what he found was that 96% of unchurched people are at least somewhat likely to attend if they're simply invited to services. 96% of people are at least somewhat likely to attend services if they're simply invited. If that stat blows your mind, listen to this. In his relationship and in his conversations with so-called church people, people who are members of churches, he found that only 2% of those so-called Christians had invited an unchurched person within the last year. 96% are willing to go. 2% are even inviting people in the first place. If we just simply go within our community, our digital community, and invite people to come to services, we're doing leaps and bounds ahead of everybody else. Never mind the fact that we go to them and ask them if they want to have a Bible study, if we can pray for them, if we can share something with them. If we just invite people to services, that goes a long way. I'll tell you also, don't cast your pearls before swine. We have a phrase for this, by the way, online on Facebook. It's called not feeding the trolls. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that. Don't feed the trolls. Because inevitably what you'll see when you go on Facebook or you go on Twitter, you go on Instagram, is you'll see status or picture, whatever it is. You'll see comment. Then underneath that comment, you'll see one of 478,000 comments underneath. And when you look at the very bottom, which is the most recent, what you'll see is two people who earlier in the chat, seemed like they were friends, they're just going after each other. And I'll never forget, for one instance, this was several weeks ago, this is why it's on my mind, logged onto Facebook, one of those 2.5 hours a day that obviously I'm on it. I logged on Facebook and I saw two preachers. And these are people that I respect, people that I love. And I saw their conversation, I saw the status had something to do with the Bible. I didn't really look at it that deeply, but I saw that there were literally 478 comments underneath it. We got down to the bottom, and these people were intense. Long comment threads, long paragraphs. And it wasn't angry, it wasn't mean, it wasn't people just yelling and pointing fingers, but you could tell it was heated. So I thought to myself after I saw this, whatever this conversation is about, I've got to figure out what's going on. Scroll to the top, and literally the question was, do you believe that Luke wrote the book of Acts? That was the question. When you roll down 478 comments all the way to the bottom, it wasn't even about Acts anymore. That was about people's moms. That was about where they went to school. It was about everything but that. A long time ago, what they should have done is at some point simply say, look, I'm going to cast my pearls before swine. I'm not going to engage in this conversation any further because here's the issue. What happens if a non-Christian sees that? What happens if a non-Christian sees that comment thread and sees people who are supposed to be Christian acting like children? Which is what Paul accused of the Corinthian church, 1 Corinthians chapter 6. When they try to bring their lawsuits before court. No one did not cast your pearls before swine anymore. In Matthew chapter 7, this is where this phrase comes from. And the big question when we talk about not casting your pearls before swine always comes to the point of, when do you know not to feed the trolls anymore? You know, and this is just my opinion, this is my understanding, but you know to not cast your pearls before swine when you know that any more words is not really going to matter. It's not really going to do anything. In Matthew chapter 7, the first 6 verses, kind of detail this dialogue down to this point. But up to this point, what Jesus is talking about, Matthew chapter 7, and these first 6 verses, these first 5 verses rather, he says, don't judge so that you won't be judged. That's where most people stop, by the way. Don't judge so that you won't be judged, for in the way you judge, you'll also be judged. By your standard of measure, it will be measured back to you. Why do you then look at the speck that's in your brother's eye, but you don't notice the log that's in your own eye? How can you say to one another, or to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, behold the log that is in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. What Jesus is addressing here in Matthew chapter 7, verses 1 through 5, is not calling your brother a hypocrite unless you first examine yourself, knowing where you stand. Being able to discern yourself. Being able to look at your own soul and say, where's my position with God? But he flips the script a little bit here in verse 6. Instead of talking about himself, now he's talking about other people. Verse 6, do not give what is holy to dogs. Do not throw your pearls before swine, or else they will trample them under your feet and turn and tear you to pieces. What we need to understand is not only our relationship with ourselves and how we discern our own bodies, but how we can discern other people as well. And if you're 38 comments deep on a Facebook thread that has simply devolved into memes and funny images, it's probably not the right place for evangelism. It's probably best to use your time and utilize it somewhere else. It's interesting to me when you look at 1 Timothy chapter 1, 2 back-to-back letters that Paul would say to the young evangelist. He exposes the fact that this idea of time wasting, this idea of the reputation of the gospel is not a 21st century problem. As a matter of fact, within the first chapter, the very first part of 1 Timothy chapter 1, he addresses this idea. And in 1 Timothy chapter 1, starting in verse 1, he says, "As I urge you upon my departure from Macedonia, remain on at Ephesus, so that you may instruct certain men not to teach certain doctrines." Don't be engaged with those things. Verse 4, "Nor to pay attention to myths and genealogies, which give rise to mere speculation rather than furthering the administration of God, which is by faith." Verse 5, the goal of our instruction. You could argue the goal of evangelism. "The goal of our instruction is love from a pure heart, from a good conscience, and a sincere faith. For some men," listen to this, and tell me this doesn't apply to Facebook in 2018. "For some men, straying from these things, have turned aside to fruitless discussion, wanting to be teachers of the law, and even though they don't understand either what they're saying or the matters about which they make confident assertions." There's a whole bunch of keyboard warriors out there that claim to be Christians. They claim to argue truth. And they will go 38 comments deep with you because they have nothing else to do with their time except pick a fight. And go off in some really weird areas. But what I'm instructing us to do, what I'm asking us to do at this point, is to use wisdom in regards to how we engage people. Unless you think this is a Facebook-only situation, we need to use wisdom in how we engage other people as well. We need to have judgment, we need to have understanding at which point our evangelism to them becomes fruitless. Not forever, but at least for the moment in time. Paul also writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 that we need to make ourselves a slave to all. There's a gross misunderstanding of this passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, where people will look at 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and what they'll attest is that what Paul is advocating is that we need to become sinful in order to reach sinful people. I knew a person who loved to hang out at bars because he would tell you that that was where he could reach the most sinful people. Now, I think that that's a gross misrepresentation, not only of 1 Corinthians chapter 9, but I find that incredibly unwise and almost borderline sinful. And so what he's talking about, though, what his argument is so many people say is, well, you have to be one of them to know them. It's kind of the Batman syndrome. I have to become the knight in order to know them. That's not what Paul is talking about. Because in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, starting verse 19, he says very succinctly, "For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a slave to all, so that I might win them all. To the Jews I became as a Jew, so that I might win the Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, though not being myself under the law, so that I might win those who are under the law. To those," verse 21, "who are without law, as without law, though not being without the law of God, but under the law of Christ, so that I might win those who are without law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I become all things to all men, so that I might by all means save some. I do all things for the sake of the gospel, so that I may become a fellow partaker of it." Paul is advocating in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, not becoming sinful, not engaging in the sinful and immoral acts of the world, but understanding them on their level. I've seen countless people, and I've been guilty of this on a number of occasions. I've seen people who will go into Facebook comment threads, and the Facebook thread will be about one thing, and I come in and just barrel it down on something else. I don't understand what the thread is. I don't understand who I'm arguing with. I don't know who I'm talking to. But I just come in both barrels and take all of them to town. And immediately after that, the next 9 comments are all question marks or funny memes or whatever it is. But in order to understand, in order to evangelize to people, we have to understand them. We have to know what it's like to be them. Not intimately by engaging in their moral acts, but we have to get on their level. In Acts the 8th chapter, when totally blanks on his name. Philip. People want to say Simon. When Philip is instructed to go out to meet the Ethiopian eunuch, I remember that name, when he's instructed to go out there, and he hears this person, this Ethiopian eunuch, addressing or reading Isaiah chapter 53, got that also. When he's reading Isaiah chapter 53, you can tell, and Philip is also just completely aware of the fact that he's reading this. But he asks him, he walks up to his chair and he says, "Do you understand what you're reading?" And this person says, "Well, how can I unless someone guides me?" But the very next comment is the anthem for this section. Because then he says, beginning from that scripture, he began to preach Jesus to them. When we talk about Matthew chapter 28, verses 16 through 20, about evangelism, and he says, "Go to them," he means go to them. Go to them. Understand where they're coming from. Address their concerns. Talk about what they want to talk about. And that goes whether you're talking about something in person or something that you're talking about online. Understand these people, know where they're coming from, and address their immediate concerns. If someone is off on a long comment thread about baptism, don't jump in with both barrels blasting on musical instruments. Unless the comment thread goes that direction. Speak on them on their level. Engage the conversation and address the concern that these people have. We're going to save souls on Facebook. This last section will go very quickly. You need to be genuine. How many times have you seen people talk about how the gospel changed their life? They post Philippians chapter 4, verse 7, or whatever the verse is, and yet their profile picture is them in a bikini holding a beer. And you immediately realize that what they are is not at all what they claim to be. So if we're going to address people online, we need to be genuine. Don't come in trying to not be who you are. Be succinct. Don't have all these long comments, which maybe this one just applies to me every Sunday and Wednesday. But be succinct. Say what you're going to say and move on. Be excellent. Don't use things that are outdated. Don't make comments that make no sense. Learn how to use a keyboard. You'd be surprised. Oftentimes I have to tell myself that. Be resourceful. There are a whole host of tools available to you online that you can use to do a whole bunch of different things on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, whatever it is. Engage these things. And I'll argue lastly. Be available. If somebody engages you in conversation and wants to talk to you about the gospel, talk to them back. I've missed several opportunities. I know I'm not the only person here this morning, but I have missed several opportunities because somebody wanted to talk to me about the gospel and either I was too busy, I didn't have time, or I just didn't like the person. If someone's going to ask me about the gospel, and if someone's going to ask you about the gospel, we need to be available. We need to understand and we need to engage in the conversation. The 15th century, a man by the name of Johannes Gutenberg invented the printing press and made movable type thing and allowed for mass production. It's worth noting, by the way, he didn't invent the printing press. That was done by the Chinese about 800 years earlier. But the Chinese really didn't engage in it as much as Europe. And so when Gutenberg invented the printing press and allowed for mass market publication of just about every document on the planet, it changed the landscape of Europe almost overnight. Immediately after you have educated people learning the Bible, talking about the Bible, the Protestant Reformation, all these different things erupting right out of it. And they were able to use that medium in a way that was able to evangelize and teach the gospel to people. When the radio came about at the end of the 19th century, the exact same thing happened. Television started in the mid-20th century, the exact same thing. Internet was exploding. It was created not by Al Gore, but by somebody else. When the internet was developed, it became a mainstream thing. It lit up websites, able to teach other people the gospel. Social media is a tool, a very efficient tool by which we can interact with human beings and teach them about the gospel. And the question for churches, and the instruction for churches, is not can we avoid social media, how quick can we get it out of our churches, but how quickly can we use it to teach other people the gospel? How can we take social media, use social media to fulfill the Great Commission on an everyday basis? That's the question for us this morning. What can I do better? What can you do better? What can we all do better to teach other people the gospel, no matter in person or online? This wasn't about what it took to become a child of God. But if you're sitting here this morning, do not let me let you go without telling you. You are not a child of God unless you've been washed in the blood. You've been baptized into his death in water, raised to walk in newness of life, confessing your sins, desiring to walk with him. We were ready for you. We'll pray for you. We'll help you in any way that you can. All you have to do is come forward.
Children go where I send
Well,
thee.
Lordy, then where will you send me? I'm gonna send thee one by one. One was a little bitty baby, born by the Virgin Mary. Born in a Bethlehem.
Children go where I send
Well,
thee.
Lordy, then where will you send me? I'm gonna send thee